June 5th, 2020. Quiet time allows for many thoughts and ideas, but you never know what's brilliance and what's lunacy. When you don't have a proper sounding board, prison seems to be an environment where one is always teetering on a tightrope that has a rebirth, realization, rejuvenation, and ultimate enlightenment on one side and divine insanity on the other. As I read the Anthony Ray Hinton story, I was intrigued by his ability to befriend and accept a reformed Klan member and murderer. Who loves a murderer? Who loves a sinner? Who decides? What act of deviance is greater than the next? Who is the judge? Is offering comfort a gesture of acceptance of the person and additionally the act? When do the lines get blurred? After having an extensive conversation with a Sereno gang member who has mastered one-step microwave meals, complete with breading and curry sauce, I realized that I could be hungry 3 to 5 days out of the week and hold her accountable for the influx of drugs in poor communities, or accept that she was, at her core, a woman, a sister, and a survivor who was operating as best she could in an environment that socialized you to be predator or prey, and the wrong choice could lead to your death. I chose to share a meal with her at least 2 days a week, listen with my mouth closed and my mind open. I mean, ain't she a woman?
I am so appreciative and excited about the conversation that we are going to have today. A conversation, we kind of termed it a conversation among sisters. And so I am elated to be joined with Claudia and Shivers on today. To have what I believe is a very necessary conversation. More formally, we've been having a lot of conversations in our work around this idea of mapping the intersection of what we've considered diversity and inclusion work with social justice work. And these conversations really call for organizations and leaders to no longer see themselves within or existing within a vacuum or within the proverbial walls, now virtual walls of the organization. This conversation or these conversations are about moving beyond the boardroom, expanding our conversations to include equity, justice, and our roles in a much broader social change ecosystem, which means, centering racial equity, racial justice, and not just our conversations, but our strategy and our work. And so in this moment in time, this current movement is really calling for what many would consider a total overhaul of our systems, more specifically our criminal justice system as we've come to know it. There have been calls to defund the police, abolish the prison system, what has evolved into a form of modern day slavery, and investing in restorative forms of justice centered on community, humanity, proactively removing the barriers that continue to exist and be perpetuated as the norm. And as much as these conversations are, top of mind today, I would venture to say that a lot of the dialogue around criminal justice, more specifically, or the school to prison pipeline or the prison industrial complex, oftentimes is centered around the experiences of Black men. Mm-hmm. And sure, that's valid. We also know that Black women, Black girls, Black mothers are also disproportionately impacted by these very same systems. We don't talk about that as much. And so it is certainly our belief, my belief, that we can't begin to fully understand, much less solve, for these complex issues if we're not amplifying the voices, the perspectives of those most impacted by them, right? Which is what this conversation is about. Amplifying, amplifying experience, amplifying the humanity, certainly amplifying the journey of Claudia Shivers. And so I'm super excited for this discussion today, and all the more grateful that Shavara connected us so that we could align today and be part of the impact we're seeking to see. That's my intro, y'all. That is my intro. I'm going to stop because what the people are here to hear, who we are here to hear from and amplify, certainly is not myself, but none other than Claudia. And so, at the top of our learning experiences, we sometimes will offer for ourselves an I am statement, honoring the complexities and nuances of who we are and how we show up in this conversation. And so I'm wondering, Claudia, if you wouldn't mind just kind of kicking off and sharing a little bit more about yourself and who you are, perhaps even framing it in the context of I am.
Okay. All right. So I did write a little bit just because, I could come up with an infinite number of things that I am, right? So I'll just read this and then add a little bit of flavor to it while I'm reading it, right? So I am from the rich soil of the Congo and the divine spiritual tribes of Nigeria. I am from Dudley's hair grease and Jerry curls. We didn't want the Jerry curls, y'all, but my mama made us get them. I am from 219 West Side Drive in Lexington, North Carolina, or as we call it, the barbecue capital of the world. I'm from the plantations of Virginia by way of an involuntary, all-expense-paid cruise ship from the African shores. Our ticket was punched around 1725. I am filled with purpose and called to lead. My nostrils are still filled with the smell of the warm living jungles from my birthplace. I am opepe, or African peach, which is a wood that grows in Nigeria. I ignite in 15 seconds, burn for 65, and have an 82-second afterglow. I am spades parties at Miss Minnie's house, sardines, hey, and pork and beans, right? So, and I am, you must be a clot filter with your wide nose, right? From Walter and Queen Esther Shivers, I am from great intelligence and equally quick wit. I am from Can't is not a word, and your dark skin is so beautiful, it shows how strong you are. I am from Jehovah's Witnesses and from First Baptist Church. I am from Macon, Georgia, Trenton, New Jersey, and the Southern Bantu people. From chitlins, pig feet, souse meat, and collard greens. From Saffronia Rose, who killed her first husband with a hat pin because she suspected him of infidelity. Saffronia, who would not open her door to even let her children in after sundown, just to keep the evil spirits out. From Liza Knots, don't split the pole or let anybody sweep your feet because it's all bad luck. At Granddaddy's house are all the family pictures from yesterday and back in 1910. Granddaddy's house is the family museum, the keeper of reminders of the rich heritage from which I grew.
Thank you for that.
Thank you, Claudia. One thing that I'm thinking might be helpful is if, before we even get into our questions and our discussion here, Shavara, you read that passage. I wonder if you could give some folks, perhaps if they haven't made the connection yet, just a little bit of context about what you read there, especially after Claudia has shared a little bit more, or following Claudia sharing a little bit more about herself, where she's from.
Sure. Thank you for that, Brittany. And I am just so honored to be in this sister space with the both of you. What I was reading earlier is a letter that Claudia sent me. She was imprisoned for about 10 months this past year. And when she first went away to camp, I encouraged her to write down everything she thought, everything she saw, everything she dreamed. And so she started writing me these really beautiful, powerful letters. Oftentimes fleeting thoughts, sometimes about the women who were there with her, um, and sometimes about what she missed from home. Yeah.
I thought that might be good context as we engage in this conversation. Certainly was intentional about considering this a conversation among sisters where we can model vulnerability and certainly amplify, our experiences, and Claudia's experience here. One that we don't really talk about, even in the context of our equity and inclusion work. And so Claudia, I think it would certainly be of value to our listeners just to hear from you. Just a little bit more about your experience at camp. When I think about our current climate, what is or what was and still is a global pandemic, on the outside dealing with COVID-19, and certainly can imagine there being implications even while you were there. And so if you could just share a little bit more about your experience at camp, and what the impact has been on you.
So I really like that you ladies keep saying camp, because I am intentional when I say that, because there is a difference in the different institutions and the different levels of security. And we often said this is really a camp because the activities that we did most often was crocheting and knitting, right? So anything you need that you don't have, somebody can crochet you one, or so anything, right? But as far as it relates to the pandemic, for one thing, because it's a camp, there are no locked doors, there are no real walls. So the space that you inhabit is pretty much like if you were in a gym, right? So there were 8 different units, 4 per building. And so I was in A1, unit A1. So everybody's on one floor in bunk beds, and you're separated by a partition, okay? But it doesn't go to the wall. It only goes up to maybe 5 feet. So at the time that the pandemic hit, because I was at a working camp, everybody used to work, but then we had to stop working because we had to go on lockdown, right? But there's no way to really be quarantined if you don't have a wall and you don't have doors, right? And you're interacting with everybody all day, but then if you once you're on lockdown, you cannot go back to work, right? So now you're in a space with 130 other women, and somebody's telling you that there's something that's deadly and highly infectious, and that Black people are gonna get it first and they're gonna die first, right? And also, typically, white women are typically the ones who have their crimes were considered less violent, right? So if anybody qualifies to go home early because of the pandemic, it would be them, but they're not the most vulnerable people in that community, right? So then you start to see division, right? Because now the white people, there's a lady named Linda, right? So she started writing letters all the time, and we always laugh because we said when she was writing the letters, they must have said, "I am a white woman," right? Because she wrote to Jay-Z, she wrote to Van Jones, she wrote to Chance the Rapper. She got one letter that was returned to her because of it didn't have a valid address from Young Jeezy. Okay. So, and we were asking her, like, do you even know who these people are? And she said,
what
no.
Was these letters? I'm like,
I can't be here because I'm going to die here. I have to go home.
Gotcha.
That's pretty much what it said. And every day, her and her bunkie would get up and they would go watch CNN all day long, right? just to see the death count, because CNN always had the number, the number of deaths. Like Fox News, everybody, they talk about other things, but CNN was showing the numbers. And every time those numbers went up, they were more excited. They were more encouraged, right?
Mm.
Because the more deadly it is, the more likely you're going to go home, right?
Wow.
But because most of the African American women were considered like a higher risk of recidivism, or they may have had what they called a violent crime. So if you or if you're there for a bank robbery, but you just signed a note, you wrote a note, give me the money, right? It's still categorized as a violent crime. So now you don't even qualify to be considered to go home. So now Linda is going to go home. So she's waiting to see who's dying. And then most of the people who are dying, the 80% in New York are African American people, right? Because of pre-existing health conditions or comorbidities. So now how that's internalized is Linda's happy because all the Black people are dying, right?
Mm.
So then everybody started getting in little groups. They became really segregated. And because there's no privacy, you can hear everybody talking. And one time there was even a group of people that started fighting Black people against white people just because the tension was so high. So you're now excited about death, right? And now people that didn't consider themselves to be racist are now separated by race.
Mm-hmm.
And you're just hoping for some opportunity. You're just so desperate for an opportunity to get home, because at the same time, you don't have the same access to the phones or emails, that kind of thing, because you're on lockdown. Then you can't check on your family. So you see a lot of people go to the phone. A lot of Black and brown people go to the phone and come back because somebody in their family has been infected.
Mm-hmm.
One young lady, her children, she left them with her aunt who had diabetes, and she's had both legs amputated since she's been incarcerated. So now she's calling her aunt who has diabetes with no legs, and she's worried about her aunt and the children, but Linda gets to go home before her because she dated a drug dealer. She didn't sell drugs, she dated a drug dealer, but she didn't tell on him when she got arrested. So now she has to serve 7 years, right? So it just became extremely tense, and the pandemic sort of made it worse.
Claudia, it's interesting because when the nation went into, when we first received the order from administration in DC that our nation was going to have to quarantine, a lot of the language that you would hear on social media were people complaining that they were in lockdown. And, to the point you just made, people in prison don't have the freedom to socially distance themselves and are most at risk. And thinking about the crisis of humanity that you just talked about, that was a crisis of humanity, right? You've got people celebrating death who ordinarily wouldn't be celebrating death, but that is the only way that they saw a light at the end of a tunnel, that they could get home to their families. So I'm curious, just from your perspective, and language is important. Brittany and I talk about this all the time in our work. We challenge organizations to remember that language is political. It is powerful, like June Jordan told us. So this idea that people were interchangeably using lockdown and quarantine, just curious about how that lands on you.
So I thought about that earlier. I thought about that before, since I've been home, right? Because people will say, "Oh, you just got home. Oh, okay, girl. It's just like we've been in prison too, right?" And what I can relate that to is when my mom passed away, when people would say, "I understand how you feel," and you knew that they didn't, if they still had their mom, but the only way for them to understand is for them to go through it. And so you don't want them to go through it to understand, but you know that they don't understand just by the lack of levity that they give to the statement. Because being imprisoned, whether it's a camp or any or it's a maximum security facility, means that you no longer have any choices, right? So whether you live or die no longer is your decision. It is up to someone else. Somebody can come in, the warden can come in at any time and say, "Today we decided you can't watch television." Prime example with the George Floyd murder, right? So they didn't want us to get upset or start rioting.
Mhm.
So they turned off all the televisions.
Wow.
So now we're isolated from all civilization, and we don't even have television to see what's going on or to relieve the tension of our situation, because there's nothing else to do. There's no access to working out because you're on lockdown. So now you have to sit with people and you have no idea what's going on. You know, since I've been home, I can look out the window, I can walk on the front porch, you know, I can just walk around, I can talk to whoever I want to. You have choice, you have options. And once your choices are taken away from you, it changes exactly who you are. There's no way, is no way to be the same person without a choice, right? Because then you're just fighting for anything that you can hold on to. So for somebody to say it's just like we're in prison, well, you still have the option to walk out. So you can disobey the rule with not really any consequence. You can go to Walmart and you don't have to wear your mask, and Walmart's just going to say, well, you can't come in, and then you go to Target. But if we walked out to get our lunch and we didn't have on our mask, then you get an incident report, right? The incident report, we call them shots. I don't know why they call it that, but once you get an incident report, you no longer qualify to go home early based on the fact that there's a pandemic, because you simply forgot to put a mask on, right? So there are extreme consequences to the smallest choices that you do make. And then you see a lot of time people fighting for just to make any choice, any decision in their own lives. But just to sit in your own house, you know, there's every single person at that camp, every single one of the 865 people would have given almost anything to sit at home and pretend that they couldn't go outside, as opposed to not really be able to go outside, you know?
Yeah, thank you for that. You know, Claudia, I was thinking about impact on family. When I was a little girl, my stepfather was he had been a civil rights activist, and in the midst of that, had a horrible addiction to cocaine and heroin, and spent some time at a penal farm. And my little sister and I, we would push our little bodies flat on the floor of the car when we were riding out to the penal farm, because we were convinced that everybody would know. Like, there was a sign on the car that said "Bound for the Big House." I don't know why I thought people knew, but I was convinced that everybody knew where we were going. And, you know, the dehumanization of that experience, that was back in the 80s, when they were still like cutting through cakes and checking your clothes, and it was really humiliating. And once we walked through what for me felt like a portal of the entryway, there were these beautiful grounds with a lake and ducks and seesaws, and families were loving each other, and there was all this talent. It was a men's prison, a penal farm, but there were artists and woodworkers. I remember, though, the immense shame that I felt, and the connection. I felt that I, too, was somehow imprisoned because my stepfather, who I loved very much, was imprisoned. And at the same time, when I would be there visiting him, I felt this incredible sense of pride, because he would walk us around and show us off. And he also was clean when he was in prison. So I actually liked visiting him in prison versus him terrorizing us at our home. And so I'm just curious, you have children, you have a daughter who had to stay away, had to go away while you were away for safety, and so that she could continue school. And so I'd love to hear just some of your reflections about the impact on your family in particular, and then what that impact meant to you, how that landed on you.
So I like that you said dehumanization, right? So I have a saying that grew out of my camp experience. Dehumanization happens one small act of indifference at a time, right? So the impact.
Can you repeat that, Claudia? Can you repeat that?
Dehumanization happens one small act of indifference at a time, right? So my children, I've been an unwed mom for several years, for 28 years, right? And mostly by choice, because I always put the kids first. I have fought every day that I have been a mom to make sure that they had an identity in the world, right? So when they go to school, I make sure everybody knows that we're all present. We're a unit. So what being away from the family does, and them not having access to you, it breaks up the unit, and it takes away the security that they had, right? So you have confident children, right? I have a son who was a linguist in the Navy. He translates Arabic, right? He was there. He served 6 years. He got out in September of 2019. He's extremely confident. Everybody loved him. They wanted him to stay in, but he did not want to because he needed to reconnect with at least his sisters, right? He's been away from all of us since he graduated from high school. So he graduated in July, he left in August, right? But just the fact that the option to visit was no longer there made him come back to reconnect with his sisters. I have my two oldest daughters. They had children before I left, and I was at the hospital for both of the births. And then each one of them had another child while I was gone, and they were petrified while they were at the hospital without their mom, because they have great relationships with the rest of the family and their dads. However, it's not the same when you've grown up as a unit. My daughter who she went out to Vegas. She was with very close friends. She was completely safe, and she hated every second of it, right? She had access to, Rick Ross, the young lady she was living with, would text and say, haha, KD is so funny. And she's talking about Kevin Durant. So any kid's dream. But she was like, I just want to come home because my mom is not there, but I need somebody, right, who can be there. So I could hear they were being positive and encouraging because that's what I taught them, and they wanted to keep me encouraged, but I could hear the fear in their words, right? Because what they always knew to be true was no longer true, right? Mom is always going to be here. And so then when someone takes it away and you have no control of it, because if it were up to them, they would have said, we'll all just go, right? And then you wouldn't have felt like you were in prison at all. But because they did not have that option, I could hear the fear in their voices no matter what their words say. So I always say that words are the sounds that your heart makes, right? So if you have fear in your heart, then that's what's going to come out of your mouth. So when they're talking to me and I can hear them being encouraging, but you can hear just small words that means that they need you to be there just so you can give them a hug. Because not having a hug from your mom in 10 months is bad, but in 5 years is even worse, right? So thankfully I wasn't gone so long that it got worse, but you have families that easily their daughter is now, being promiscuous because who's gonna supervise her, right? You have sons that are now selling drugs because who's gonna supervise them, right? So my children did what they knew to do. We used to say, when we go to the mall, if we get split up, everybody meet back here, right? So meet back at the home base, right? And so they knew to meet back at home. When I got here, everybody was here. But that's because we got split up, and you could tell that there was the fear. So just the fear and the insecurity that now we're all going to just go to family counseling together.
Yeah, thank you for that. You were talking about the family as a unit, and I'm thinking, family is village too. So while you were away and imprisoned at camp, who was your village? What did it, is there something that's different and unique about building a village in an incarcerated state that is different than the way that, you build sisterhood in other spaces?
There's definitely a difference, right? And I kind of laugh just because, I'm having thoughts while you're asking the question. Well, first of all, your outside village, which is very important because you always need to remember why you're doing what you're doing. So in prison, it's easy to forget who you are and go with what the majority is doing, right? So you need people on the outside to remind you who you are, to remind you why you're making good choices. So people sending you books, I know I've always heard people say, you got to send them some money because they're in prison, but it's really nothing to buy. It's not like you at the mall, right? So, but books they allow you to leave where you are, right? So that's very important. So I had one friend who all she did was send me books. That's all she did. She's a principal. She knows the importance of books. My siblings they always answered the phone. It didn't matter what they were doing or where they were. They always answered the phone, right? And then just somebody being on the receiving end of a letter, which is why Shavara is such a wonderful spirit in the universe, because I just need to send a message out. I might not be able to come tell you myself, but I just need to send the message out, right? So I just need to get these words outside of this wall. And then on the inside of the wall, so, I always made friends like at one point in life because they were fun. Then at another point because they helped my career development. But at camp, your friends, your best friends, are the ones who know the most how to navigate prison, right? Which usually means they're a little questionable on the outside, right? So, you say, oh my God, it's a pandemic, they're looting, and you sitting on your bed like, oh, this is terrible. And then somebody else walks in, they say, oh my God, you never believe what my family got when they went looting. And you're like, oh okay. Oh, okay. Okay.
That's real. That's real.
And so and one thing is that they were all very accepting, right? So they meet you where you are and they accept you. So all those memes that you read on Facebook about acceptance, that's what they do in prison because they're so used to it. Their mind is open to whatever the possibilities are, and they're survivors. So they're fine. They just need to know who you are. So they always said, that we had a running joke because they gave us a rate of how likely we were to recidivate, right? So my rate of recidivism is minimum, which is 0, never, ever going back. So they would say, Claudia, what you doing over there with your minimum self, right? Because they was mediums and highs, right? But if you've never been to prison, you go in and you like, gratitude is attitude, right? And then somebody's going to eat you up. So you have to learn to be with people who can teach you how to take care of yourself, but also not appear too mean at the same time, because you can't offend too many people, because you have to protect yourself, and you have to learn to protect yourself by your actions, right? Because anything you do to get in trouble is going to keep you there longer. So you have to learn to have a presence of, I'm not for that, we're not doing, this is just what we're not doing, right? And so you hang around the people who nobody is going to try, right? So you hanging around a medium and a high, because if somebody try you, you might say, well, it's okay, you probably needed a hug today, that kind of thing. But you end up, you might end up in a fight. They always say, because I communicate, right? I'm an over communicator. And so they would say, Claudia, you so messy. And I won the Messy Bessie Award because we had a little talent show, and I won the award because I communicated so much. But I was like, guys, all these problems could be solved if we just talk. But see, in a criminal community, we're not talking, right? Silence is golden, right? So I just had to hang out with the people who were the most experienced. And to me, it made me a better person, because you learn the value in everybody. Because before my camp experience, if I'd have met any of those people, I would have never talked to them. I would have been preaching from the mountaintops about how bad mass incarceration is, but I would have never talked to somebody who had been incarcerated in the masses, right? So now I've learned who they are, and they've learned who I am. And so now they can talk through me, right? Because they are not going to go in a boardroom and just sit down on the first try and have a great conversation, but they can talk to me, and then I can deliver the message, right? And again, why I love Shavara so much, because I can deliver the message to Shavara and she's going to get it to the right person, right? So now where we were at the grassroots, we got grass and we got roots down here, and then we hand it off to Shavara, and then she Usain Bolt with it, So my village, it continues to grow, but now I've learned how important the village is, right? So
power in the collective. I've been like taking notes and theming over here, over some of the stuff that we've discussed so far. And so one of the things that I heard and am just thinking about is how even sort of hierarchy, persists, right, in different systems, which was really evident in how you shared your experience, the racial dynamics, particularly, the class dynamics, even, in the context of this global pandemic. And I thought about Shivers' follow-up to that around how people on the outside have perceived, COVID, lockdown, and even this, there was a phrase going around how COVID is the greatest equalizer or something to that effect. This global pandemic has been the equalizer, where our experience is even what you have shared thus far, challenges that, and it hasn't been the equalizer because we still experience it, even in the context of your camp, very differently based on how we're situated in this hierarchy. And I just think about, the politics of you needing to navigate, and maybe politics isn't the word, but just needing to adapt how you had, for survival within the camp, but also in anticipation and hope for, leaving the camp. But just kind of like what all of that entailed. And then it got me to thinking, because my mind has just been racing over here as I process something you mentioned about the impact on your family. And so I think about how oftentimes when we have these conversations, we're not prioritizing humanity and people. We're thinking about numbers without equal attention to the generational impact, right? And that's kind of where we get into systems. When we think about generational impact, when we think about small indifference, how incremental indifference, I love what you said earlier. Dehumanization happens one small indifference at a time. Inequity, folks listening, inequity, isms, structures that oppress happen in incremental forms of indifference, inaction, right? And so I kind of want to talk about this systemic, right? I want to use that framing as a way to transition into, the role of systems, specifically in the context of, the transition back home. There's an African proverb that I think is relevant to this conversation, and it's not verbatim, but it talks about, you teach a man, you teach a person, but you teach a woman, and you are essentially educating an entire generation,
right.
Which is particularly important in the context of this discussion, because when we talk about Black women being disproportionately impacted by the flaws of our criminal justice system, we're talking about the impact on families, generations to come, Black women being primary, you mentioned it, breadwinners, and now this having a socioeconomic, impact. And so,
Brittany,
I just said a lot. I'm gonna throw that out there and just get y'all's reactions to that, right? Just the system.
Brittany, I was thinking, over the past quarter century, there's been a profound change in the involvement of women within our prison industrial complex, our criminal justice system. I mean, between 1980 and 2017, the number of incarcerated women increased by more than 750%.
Wow.
And although there are more men in prison than women, the rate of growth for female imprisonment has been twice as high since 1980. I mean, there are 1.3 million women under the supervision of the criminal justice system. And, one of the things I was thinking about, Claudia, we had a conversation the other day, and you were talking about some of the post-conviction barriers to re-entry that uniquely impact and affect women. So I'd love to hear your thoughts around one, not just the high rate of incarceration, but disproportionately how women are impacted, and to the point that Brittany made, that women, and the point that you made, women take care of entire communities. And so if you are, for example, providing support, financial support, economic support to women. They aren't just going to take care of themselves. They are building community. And when we think about women in prison who are mothers, more than 60% of women in state prisons have a child
Wow.
at the age of 18, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So I like that you have the numbers to go with it, right? But when we take the numbers and turn it into people, right? So that's what you do from the bridge between grassroots and corporate, right? Is turning the numbers into people, right? So 750 times is a lot, but also there were already, because you said, Shavara, there are more men incarcerated than women. So those fathers weren't in the families. And so those fathers left a family. And so there were single moms. So now the stability of that family is now ruined, because now the mom, because the ones that are more likely to be incarcerated are the ones who already were affiliated with incarcerated people, right? So now the moms are now gone from those families. So then what's going to be expected of the children is to operate as a healthy individual without being given any of the tools. As a matter of fact, you took all the tools away from them. So there's no way to pull yourself up by your bootstraps if you don't even have boots, right? So children, say 2 or 3 years old, when your mom leaves, you don't understand where she went, and you don't understand why she won't come back, right? And then when you go to school, you're always looking for her to come back. So now you're poor performing in school, and nobody can deal with your attitude. So you may have started out at grandma's house, and then you may end up at auntie's house, and then you might just end up in the in foster care because nobody else could handle you, because what you were trying to say, right? You were bleeding with hurt, right? You were trying to tell somebody, and they didn't want to get that all over them, so they passed you on to somebody else. And based on the systems, there's supposed to be somebody more qualified. So the social service system, there's supposed to be a social worker who is now more qualified, but that ignores the fact that the social worker is a person, right?
Mm-hmm.
Who has their own issues at home. They have their own ideas of what's supposed to happen. So the expectation of a social worker who came from a healthier situation is that you operate like them. I did it, why can't you, right? But you don't have the proper tools. So now you create a generation of children who will become adults, who will be twerking outside, and they're gonna sell all the drugs that they can get their hands on, because, as they say, I got to get it how I live, right? So, and then there becomes an honor, like I'm paying homage to my parents who are now incarcerated because I'm so hard in these streets. One of the young ladies said to me, my name rings in these streets. Okay, so now you want your name to ring because your mama's name is ringing, right? And also, you don't know any other life. One of the young ladies had been selling drugs since she was 14. She was 39 when I met her, right? And she was very good at it, right? But her mother was her co-defendant, but not because her mom was a criminal mastermind, but because her mom benefited from the drugs that she was selling. So her mom was using drugs before she started selling them. She began to sell the drugs because that's just what her life was. So now her 69-year-old mom has 9 years to do in prison, and she has 11, right? But that is all that she knew, and she's proud of herself because her name rings in the streets, right? But if someone had helped her mom, who was using meth, if somebody had helped her, if someone had identified that she was sick, then someone saw a 14-year-old missing school. You don't start selling drugs and go to school every day, right? But you're clearly highly intelligent because you managed this long, right? So if someone had noticed that mom was sick, but they didn't, and then they could have noticed that the child was sick, but they didn't, right? Then you're just going to keep recreating. The situation is going to get worse, right? So anything that you do a lot, you're going to get better at it. It's going to become more efficient. So the system becomes more efficient at breaking up families. and then creating a negative space for Black and brown families to try to grow. So you have no tools to operate. You're frowned upon. Nobody accepts you. I'm actually still wearing an ankle monitor because I came home early, so they still want to make sure I don't know what, but so I have an ankle monitor. So if I walk outside and I don't have on pants, then everybody's going to know, right? It's like a scarlet letter. Everybody's going to know, oh, well, she must have committed a crime. She must be a criminal. She must be bad. We can't talk to her. So then what is the rush? Because what I was told by the people at the halfway house who are monitoring me is they have an expectation that you go to work within 21 days, right? But who's going to hire you? Because they already know that they already have been told that they can't trust you. So who's going to hire you, and what kind of job is that going to be? And I can say, because I went to federal prison, that if you're on a federal level, there's a certain dollar amount that you're accustomed to having just to have your lifestyle. So, and I'm just speaking in general. So there's no way you're going to tell somebody, well, you can go to a factory or you can go to food. They offered Food Lion as one option. So the grocery store, you're not going to tell somebody that, and then they're going to go work 40 hours a week and they're going to make minimum wage, which is about $7-8, which after taxes is about $4. So make $4 an hour, be away from your family again, and somebody's going to monitor you. And then they're going to follow up. The people who are monitoring you are going to follow up with your employer to make sure that you're doing what you're supposed to do. You cannot quit the job without someone's permission, right? So you have to prove the case that for some reason it wasn't working out. You cannot pursue your passion because everybody knows that the grocery store is not your passion, right? So now the barrier is, when am I going to get the mental health help that I need, right? Because that is definitely an issue. Because and also I'm not going to perform well at work because now I'm on edge. I'm extremely irritable, and the smallest thing has, what your normal communication used to be is not what it is now, right? So what is safe to say before you've been incarcerated is no longer safe to say after you've been incarcerated. So I've talked to so many people that have said, oh, you got me messed up, right? So when you go to work, that's what you're going to say. When your employer says, I need you to work overtime. Oh, you got me messed up. Oh, I'm not doing that, right? So now you're not even an employable candidate, right? And you have to work at a place that you would have never been before. And you're probably smarter than those people because there's some highly intelligent people who are incarcerated because they run criminal organizations, right? So they're highly intelligent. So you have to listen to people who you know aren't as smart as you, and you have to humble yourself, and not because you like the job, but because you like your freedom, right? And so there's a whole system that has been created, and there's a disconnect between telling the president of a company, we need you to be more aware of what's going on, and the hiring manager, because the hiring manager doesn't even know who the president of the company is, right? So the hiring manager, he just got up and came to work just like you did. He working 40 hours. He thinks he's underpaid just like you do, right? So he has no sympathy. So when you go in with the ankle monitor on, there's no incentive for him to be a more compassionate human being, except if somebody at the top has given him not only orders and ideas, but a compensation to allow them to be more compassionate, right? So I'm not going to be compassionate at $40,000 a year because I still got to work another job. So if I got to work hard, you got to work hard. So there's the lack of compassion. So just small things. So everybody,
incremental stuff,
right? So everybody needs to make livable wages, and then you can sit back and relax, right? And say, okay, now how do I talk to Claudia as a person and not as somebody who need to get back on the right track because I already know what she did, right?
Claudia, I'm sorry. So tell me a little bit about, like, from, your reentry. What has that been like for you psychologically? What has that been like emotionally? What has the job search been like? I mean, what kind of fears or challenges internal that you've experienced since you've been home?
So my reentry, first of all, it was sudden. I had no idea that I was going to come home earlier. So I was prepared. I had prepared myself for February 2021. So all of a sudden somebody walks out and says, you can go. But it seemed like just as suddenly somebody said, you're going to prison. So now I have anxiety about what's next, right? If you open the door when somebody knocks, is it somebody who's coming to arrest you, right? What so you start planning in your mind, what did I do wrong? So UPS is knocking at the door because you can't go anywhere because you have on a monitor, so you ordered something. But when UPS comes to the door, you don't want to open the door because you don't know who it is, right? So there's a lot of anxiety. I've talked to someone else who came home in March, and she said her first trip to the grocery store, she broke down crying, right? Because she was so afraid that she was doing something wrong. She just knew she was going to end up back in prison. So you're always thinking, I might go back to prison. And so then along with that, then you stay up all night, right? Because you got to see what's going on. You need to make sure nobody gets you in the middle of the night, right? Which means you don't sleep well at night. And when you do fall asleep, then you have anxiety even in your sleep. You having nightmares about, what if I go back to prison? What if this wasn't all real? What if they made a mistake? And literally there was a woman who left, who was doing a 20-year sentence, and they came back to get her because they said, oh, we forgot, we didn't realize you don't qualify to be home. So you hear the story, so you know it's real, right? So to somebody else it's a fear, but to you it's a real thing. So you can't sleep and you really don't eat that much, right? Because I mean, you're just thinking about not going back to prison. And then even the job search, well, what happens is when you go interview for a job, if they offer you the job, then the people who are monitoring you call the job to say, well, you know, she's a felon, right? So even if you already kind of got that out of the way, now the follow-up call gives them kind of a pause, you know? And what if I didn't want them to know in the first conversation that I had been incarcerated before, you know? What if I just want to wait a little bit? So now you've been labeled at work and now you can't sleep, you're really not eating well. So even just the mental health aspect of it, you know, and I was only gone for 10 months, right? So
your minimum, right? That's what I'm thinking about. Like imagine, so, you know, when you go back to you all's, like when we think about just the irony in what is supposed to be a transitional support,
right.
You know, ends up being another perpetual barrier. Right? Like, and I even think about, you know, I'm sitting here just processing and thinking about for someone who is, from your perspective, you know, as you shared, minimum risk and, you know, all of these things, the barriers still persist. I've been thinking about just this notion of restorative justice, because I think it can seem like really aloof to people who are not intimately familiar with this work or even these experiences. And so as I'm hearing you reflect, Claudia, I'm like, you know, for the folks we support and who are listening, restorative justice is essentially intended to be very proactive, right? Very proactive, anticipating and knowing that we exist in a structure that is obviously like inherently racist and capitalist, and that it just is that way. And so actively building supports to address those, to disrupt those and dismantle those. That's what restorative justice is about, proactively. And so I even think about, you didn't call it, I don't think you talked about trauma or named it trauma, but that's one of the things that that has been like, when you talked about how this, even just kind of going back to the generational impact, I'm reading this book on how trauma shows up in culture, how trauma has shown up in, we haven't necessarily done the work to heal it. And there's this author, Resma Minicum, he says, trauma decontextualized, and so trauma without, you know, or trauma decontextualized ends up looking like sort of like cultural norms or patterns, right? Trauma decontextualized ends up looking like personality flaws, people associating with personality flaws, like trauma decontextualized ends up looking like that sort of that dehumanization that happens when people can say, you know what, I'm not going to help or support because they are that way or that group is that way.
Right.
And so when I think about restorative justice and the role of people in power, organizations, systems, like proactively even addressing that is a huge part of the work. Certainly cultural competence, racism, all of these things. But I'm thinking, I keep going back to your quote about humanizing and dehumanization, right? A lot of that happens because we're not even thinking about the impact that all of these systems and incremental shifts, you named it, the hiring manager who feels as though they can't even extend compassion, right, ends up being part of that sort of like perpetual, which is why our work is so important. That keeps coming up for me, just like trauma. And when we talk about the intersection of equity, justice, inclusion, I don't know that we can get to sort of solutions without identifying ways in which people in power, organizations start to proactively address that in the ways that they've perpetuated, even in, as industries, in their systems. Yeah, that's something that came up for me. I want to transition into just kind of like, what's on the horizon. I think there's an enormous opportunity and a call to action as it relates to this conversation, and how people who are listening can act, can engage, can support. And so I think maybe a good start point is share more about, what's next for you, aspirations for self, and then certainly for the community, right? I think about how you kicked off, which I am from. Talk to us about where you're going, and all of that.
So since I'm never going to work at the grocery store because it's just not going to work for me, right?
And that's real. And that's okay. Like, let's just, you know what I mean? Because let's just talk, like, there's a narrative. Like, there's a narrative that would suggest, and I see it on memes and social media all the time, that based on, people need to take what they can get because of what, and that gets back to that dehumanization, right? And so I just want to affirm, even for anyone who finds themselves leaning into that thinking as they listen and hear this conversation, she need to take what she's gonna get. I reject that, right? I reject that.
And so since that's not my path, right? Since that is definitely not my path, I have been researching, and now I'm working on becoming what they call a peer support specialist as just a starting point, which is you work one-on-one with people who've been through what you've been through and help them along the process to help them become more successful, right? And of course that's to help them, but it also helps you, right? And it keeps you grounded and it keeps you humble. And then to build on that, so I wrote in my gratitude journal on September the 5th, 2019, right? Because I had to find some gratitude. I'm going to sell coffee because I'm going to show people how coffee can change lives, right? So what the idea is and what the goal is and what we're working on right now is a reentry program, but it's a coffee roastery, right? It's called the Freedman's Bureau, right? To pay homage to the original Freedman's Bureau, to help people who were formerly in bondage, right, to transition back into society. So teach people skills like roasting coffee, which is a very valuable skill, right? And it also gives you some independence, and you don't have to work traditionally, right? And then also offer a barista training program, because while you have the coffee shop and the roastery, you can train people to be baristas, and then you can partner with major coffee chains and offer them, if you hire my people, then we get a little kickback, but also they get a job, and they don't have to, nobody has to make the call to say, they're a felon, right? Because it's all understood, because you coming from here, this is where you coming from, right? But the coffee was originally discovered in African countries, right? In Ethiopia, right? So for so many years, people in African countries used it, but did not know that they could use it to build wealth. And then it was stolen from them when they were brought, and then they were brought here to America and taken to other countries outside of America to cultivate the coffee, because other people didn't know how to grow it. So now we might as well take back what we were growing anyway, right, and use it to build our communities back up. So the Freedmen's Bureau is to do that. So we're working on that right now. We already have some coffee that we're currently, selling right now, mostly on the internet or at little pop-up coffee shops or having coffee parties. So the brand of the coffee is Queen Coffee Bean, because real queens use queen beans, right? So
I'm here for it.
so we have a chocolate cherry that everybody loves, right? But also, in a rich brown culture, there's no way that you do anything without a little soul in it. So we have the coffee in a coffee shop, and it is your third place, as other places consider themselves to be. If you're not at home, you're not at work, you gonna be here, right? But with some soul in it. So I went to the Freedmen's Bureau today. I had my cup of coffee, and I talked to the 17-year-old aspiring hip hop artist, right? So a 65-year-old grandma with the 17-year-old young man. That's a community that's being built there, right? And it's a built-in mentorship already, right? So you just teach people who already had the skill on how I'm gonna buy a little bit and I'm gonna sell it for more, right? They already know that skill. They already understand that. So how can we apply that? And then the only limitation is what you put on yourself, right? So how many, you can roast a pound of coffee beans in 15 minutes, right? So every 15 minutes you got another pound of coffee beans is another $20 that you just made, right? So you just get people to thinking about it. And then a coffee shop, a coffee roastery, the whole family can work there, right? Mom and dad can work there, 16-year-olds can work there, and then you have a few, a book area so somebody can chill out and relax. So I just want to bring the soul, coffee shops into urban communities, because we don't have those. Just a third place, right, for us to take back something that was taken from us, build our own economy, right, build a coffee economy, and then rebuild the communities. So
I love it. And if anybody from Starbucks or any other major a chain is listening, or any organization for that matter, who has since put out a statement articulating their commitment to racial justice, racial equity, and building communities, here we have in real time a very direct way to activate, right? Activate that, allyship, activate that espoused advocacy. 3 key words that came up for me as you were sharing: community, humanity, and justice, right? Community, humanity, and justice. I think that's worth naming, because in the context of what is a very individualistic culture, you mentioned pull your bootstraps up,
right.
That whole hierarchy, get up the food chain kind of thing, where that is the norm. Community, humanity, and justice, in its simplest form, are acts of resistance, right?
Right.
That is the work. Community building, humanity, and recognizing it in each of us, and justice, right? That's the work. That's the work. Where can people find you? I see the sticker in the back, but perhaps
you can go to ClaudiaShivers.com, right, and click on the share with Claudia button, and then that sends me messages directly. And of course, I'm on social media, but the ClaudiaShivers.com is the most efficient way, to get in contact with me.
And there's a beautiful, beautiful blog on there. I am curious, as we're winding down our time together, Claudia, what about yourself did you discover that most surprised you while you were?
And I don't know how to make this sound graceful or anything. I discovered that I do like Megan Thee Stallion, and not because I want to listen to Megan Thee Stallion all the time, but because there is a freedom and a liberty into saying this is who I am,
Oh,
and I don't care what anybody else thinks, right? So it's not that per se, I'm her biggest fan, but it's the message that I got from so many women who had been in the criminal justice system for a long time. They were, I would say, oh, well, I think she uses crack. And then somebody would say, so, right? Oh, okay, right. So, right, because there's power in so, right? So what? So what, she uses crack. So now what? So what? She doesn't deserve a chance. She's not a person, right? So I learned that it is okay to love someone that I did not agree with, right? And to love them wholly, not just as long as they're only doing the right thing, because nobody only does the right thing, right? One of the ladies there used to always say, I call this caught camp, because it's a lot of people doing crime, but we are the ones that got caught, right? So it's a lot of people that you feel like you can love them because it's safe, right? But that's just because they didn't get caught doing anything, right? So, or not yet anyway. So I learned that it's okay. It's okay to listen to Nina Simone and read Nikki Giovanni, and it's okay to quote all of those wonderful, beautiful women. Listen to MC Light, and then also listen to Megan Thee Stallion say, it's a hot girl summer, and because before I would have been like, you're not even doing anything with your summer, right? So that is what
I love it.
Thank you for
You can do both.
right.
Both, and we're always talking about
Yes.
Right.
Duality. I love it. This has been wonderful. Again, a stop point for what I believe will be continued conversations that really get us focused on and understanding the work beyond our organizations, beyond the sort of proverbial walls, beyond the boardroom, right? These conversations matter. And certainly how we show up in these systems and act within these systems matter more now than ever.
Right.
Thank you, Claudia. Thank you,
Thank
Shivers.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah.